Benvinguts, benvingudes. Soc la María Berríos, directora de conservació. ¿No se escucha? Ahora sí. Benvinguts i benvingudes. Soc la María Berríos, directora de conservació i recerca d'aquesta casa, llar. I també soc la directora d'aquesta edició de PEI, que tinc un comitè pedagògic molt fabulós. I aquí estan Nancy Garín, Eric Beltrán, Tania Safurada, que hoy no pudo llegar, y también Elvira Yanganiose, a su vez directora de esta institución. I'm going to speak in English so that our guests can understand us, or understand me. It's a privilege to be presenting this session today. Because this session is one that we're doing in collaboration with very dear colleagues and friends of MACBA, A-Desk, and with Montse Badia, who's the director of A-Desk, and Maria Muñoz, who have in a very organic way allowed us to create a situation where the beautiful material that they are producing that is so important for the local ecology was facilitated for our PEI and allowed Ido Nahari and Adam Broomberg, South African photographer and artist, to collaborate with the entire group of our PEI participants in a workshop that I understand was very engaged and still sort of living in this space. We're very happy to work with A-Desk because I think it's very important to underline, and as also this edition of PEI is thinking about, what does it mean to write? What does critical thinking have as a role? And what does thinking about contemporary culture do? What can culture do? Can culture be a weapon in a context such as that we are living? Reading the way that A-Desk describes himself made me think of Ghassan Kanafani's obituary, a very famous line that said he was the commando who never fired a gun, whose weapon was a ballpoint pen. And yes, I believe that it's a privilege and honor to have your guest editors and A-Desk here. And I will leave Maria and Montse to introduce our guests more properly and this bodies of evidence editorial work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just very shortly to contextualize a little bit this presentation here. The origin of this talk actually took place like more than 2 years ago, in 2023. In September 2023, Adam, together with artists analyzed per Hebron, were our guest editors in A-Desk. The title of the thema they explored was intersectional solidarity. And I mention this because I think it's the thema of this edition of the PEI and the articles you can find in our web. So basically what it's about is how can bring light that different movements of resistance, the freedom for Palestine, the equality for LGBTQ+, for the indigenous, for the earth movements, for the violence to protect women in Iran, all these have in common this resistance against the oppression. And these are the wonderful texts they produce. The collaboration continues 2 years later, and is the reason of this talk today.
So, I'm going to speak in Spanish. We wanted to do it English, Catalan, and Spanish because it's the three languages of our web. So in July this year, we have again Adam Broomberg. Estoy hablando en inglés. Perdón. Tuvimos a Adam Broomberg esta vez con Ido Nahari como editores residentes en nuestra plataforma, en la sección de magazine, con el tema de cuerpos de evidencia, el tema que van a presentar a continuación. ADESC lanza un programa público anual presencial en colaboración con diferentes instituciones de Barcelona. Para cuerpos de evidencia pensamos que el MACBA sería el recipiente adecuado para presentar cuerpos de evidencia. El MACBA no solo aceptó, sino que incluyó cuerpos de evidencia en su programa de estudios independientes, de manera que aparte de servir de host para el evento, también participó del evento o participa del evento que vamos a presentar a continuación. Los ponentes brevemente son Adam Broomberg, que María ya introdujo, es artista, activista y educador, y Ido Nahari es, ahora mismo hace un doctorado sobre sociología, además es investigador. Entonces, sin más dilación, pasamos la palabra a Ido y Adam y espero que disfrutéis. Y luego hay un Q&A, ¿cierto? Gracias.
Thank you, Maria, and Maria. If you do it, can I do this in Yiddish? No. No, in all seriousness, that'll probably be the last joke because it's very heavy material. And with that, it's just, I would like to say that many of the images we're dealing with are images that contain violence and they are upsetting. So I need you all to know that. And if anyone feels uncomfortable, really feel free to leave at any point. And the upsetting nature of the images is what catalyzed this work, and it emerged out of a friendship that Ido and I formed. And I think I found such solace in conversation with Ido because I was finding myself spending more and more time on my mobile phone, waking up literally a few times in the night looking at these images. And I realized that this is an experience we're all doing, but we're doing it alone. And I felt overwhelmed, as I'm sure many of you did, by these images. And in conversation with Ido, I realized that we were able to share that, and it changed from the kind of overwhelm of a sensation to making sense. And I think the conversation allowed for that little bit of space that allowed for critical thought or for analysis, as opposed to just overwhelmed by volume or by the violence of the images.
Of course, when we planned for this conversation with you tonight, we weren't fully aware, or we couldn't really imagine, the geopolitical developments that have occurred since. And right now, we are at a moment of a so-called ceasefire, which essentially also hedges the genocide and hedges the war as a sort of finitude, as a sort of a depoliticized moment in which bygones are bygones, in which at least it appears that the conflict and this round of carnage is over. And in order to just present what this ceasefire appears and what this effect essentially looks like, we have here a very biblical appearing scene, right? Something that is hedged between the Mediterranean on the one hand and complete obliteration on the other. But what we found to be so remarkable about this image is not just what happens in the foreground of the image, but also, and no less importantly, the background, which are the Israeli cities, which remained, for the most part, intact, and at least far more intact than Gaza. And when Adam and I started working on this, I think that one of the most remarkable things that we really wanted to take care of, or really wanted to pay attention to, is that images of violence are not just that of obliteration and decimation, right? Many times it's also the deprivation of certain images, which are no less harmful.
So it's important to say that we were both living in Berlin at the time, And this is an image that you've all seen on a weekly basis coming out of Berlin. And, you know, I've experienced this on my body in Berlin, and many of us have. And I think what's notable about this image, when we look at it, is if we think of it in terms of the gaze, and who's deprived of a gaze, and who is allowed to look back at the camera, and the kind of choreography of the police, which has become a kind of universal choreography, we see it repeated over and over again, is this idea of depriving the gaze. And I think one thing Ido and I also spoke about all the time is the optics of an image like this that come out. And, you know, for us and our comrades and our friends, this is an image of police brutality. But like we were saying earlier in the seminar, for a 70-year-old German man in Essen, this image suggests a well-disciplined police, militarized force, disciplining an unruly brown body. And I think it's really important to always remember the kind of the contrary optics that are read.
When we are discussing the idea of gaze deprivation, when we are talking about this idea that it mutates and warps not only the very basic component of portraiture, which is consent, but also a form of identification. We see here that our immediate attention is given not necessarily just to these presented, and abused Palestinians, but also the soldier herself. There is an immediate affinity for the fact that she looks at us and we could look back at her. And this is something that to us is also crucial to keep in mind when we discuss such images. Many times we think that the relationship is binary between abuser and abused. But no less important is the component of us, the audience. The fact that many times these images are also created for our sake, and in the case of this particular Israeli soldier, for the entertainment of others. This image was, in fact, a watershed moment. It was posted in 2010 during one of her patrols in the occupied West Bank. And essentially, again, it was presented on social media as a form of creating social capital. And this is something, and I'll just conclude with this part, is that when we talk about the components of a militarized culture, right, and what makes a culture militarized, a militarized culture does not mean full conscription to the military, right? Because if that would be the case, Switzerland would be terrifying. What a militarized culture means is that all the aspirations and all the, desires of people within that culture depend on the military, right?
I mean, an image like this really struck me. I've got a daughter of almost the same age as this soldier, and the way she's performing on TikTok is, I could see my daughter performing exactly the same gestures. And the fact that the person in the background is invisible for her, and that she is performing a kind of universal teenage dance, makes it all the more ominous. I think here the notion of, we were talking earlier this morning, looking at the slide, and I remembered there was a quote from Jabotinsky, was it? No, Theodor Herzl at the first Zionist conference, where he said, we need a banner, we need a flag. We need something that people can wave and stand proudly under. And at that point, there wasn't a flag. And, you know, it's become this horrific emblem of this toxic nation state that keeps getting used again and again, whether it's scratched into the faces of hostages, or whether it's burnt into mountains, or I've even seen images of aeroplanes flying in the shape of the Star of David, much like Nazi planes did in the 40s.
There is something to be said about the physical component of the images that you've just talked about, right? This idea that unlike, again, the Israeli soldiers that have full control over their own bodies, over the way in which they gesture. What we see here is a complete limitation of the embodied qualities of the people who are imprisoned, the people who are abused. And here we see a case that has become notorious of a teacher from, I believe it was in Nazareth, who posted a video of her dancing on TikTok on the morning of October 7th, right? And the crime or the punishment rather, for this physical expression was a complete limitation of all sensual qualities, right? Be it cuffing her hands or covering her eyes with blindfold. And now what's important is also, again, the contextualization or the presentation of her detention with the Israeli flag on the back and a banner at the top of it saying, "Together we will win," Am Yisrael Chai, which means in colloquial terms, the people of Israel will win, will overcome.
If we compare these two images, the image on the left is a repetition of what we're seeing, this kind of, total control over bodies, in this case of a little boy. And what's interesting is the image on the right, which is a reproduction of the image on the left in the French newspapers. And they felt the compulsion to actually blur the faces of the soldiers. And so we have a hierarchy of visibility, or a hierarchy more of who's allowed to remain anonymous. And the fact that they felt the responsibility to do that is very telling.
Yeah. So we see that gaze deprivation is an assertion of power, which could serve both the abuser as they abuse the victim, but also for essentially, keeping themselves safe, right? Essentially covering their own asses, so to speak. And this is something that we see nowadays with ICE agents in North America, in which even though there is no obligation from the administrative body itself to cover their faces, there's something about this almost bandit-like imagery, right? This idea of being both outside of the law and representing it at the same time, which has become fundamental to the usage of the mask.
Mm. What we were doing in conversation as well is kind of trying to take the space to look at historical precedents for the same images. And on the left, we've got an image of from Sri Lanka of a Tamil prisoner, and on the right, the infamous image of the Palestinian prisoner. Mm. And I think it's also important on a more kind of more geopolitical, broader version to understand and to look at the genocide of the Tamils in 2002, which is literally a copy and paste of what's been happening in Gaza over the last 2 years. The bombing and Israel being involved with the Sri Lankan government. But, and the fact that these images, the image on the right, I saw an interview with an Israeli soldier who was involved in this incident, who said, these images are not leaked. These images are part of the war. They are allowed out. Mm. The Israeli control what is allowed out. And unlike Abu Ghraib, this image is allowed out because what was learned from Abu Ghraib, the reason why people refuse to actually reproduce images of Abu Ghraib is that the making of the image, as in this instance, is part and parcel of the violence.
And when we are talking about the more embodied element of abuse, when we're talking about essentially the politics of mockery, these are images that have been spread far and wide in the past 2 years of Israeli soldiers stationed in Gaza, which are essentially stealing and snatching private lingerie from the homes of those who were dispossessed and dislocated from their homes, essentially a decimation of their own private lives.
And I mean, but to actually think about them rummaging through the most private spaces in their domestic homes, in the corners of cupboards, and taking out lingerie or pieces of clothing that touch the bodies of Palestinian women, and wearing them in this kind of pantomime, which is actually performative rape. It's nothing less than that. And it runs alongside the real rape that was also amplified and actually debated and supported in the Knesset. So I don't think that these should be taken lightly.
In our involvement on such topics, we were approached by an Italian book designer. His name is Federico Vaspignani, who has collected images of IDF soldiers who used the genocide as a backdrop for their own Tinder profiles. And going back to the notion of a militarized society, we talked about how certain images could produce social capital, right? This idea that you can post your abuse of others as a means of becoming more popular, generating more clicks, further engagement, being the center of a conversation. But what we see here, which is no less important, is also the production of sexual capital, right? This idea that the glamorization of your own body depends on the obliteration of another body.
And again, there's a history of the sexualized female Israeli soldier. And there was one point where the IDF, the IOF, were having trouble recruiting soldiers from abroad, from America. And they went on a campaign using Maxim magazine, and what was the other magazine?
I think it was Sports Illustrated.
You know, and there's this kind of double-page spread of Gal Gadot, you know, the emblematic IDF soldier who's made Hollywood, like literally a double-page Playboy-like image of her, you know, thing. And this is from an agency called Alpha Gun Angel, which still exists.
The other thing that I think is no less telling is the fact that there is a need to always represent the soldiers or the violence as conducted by attractive people or conventionally attractive people. And this idea that many times there's sort of, I mean, this form of beauty also depoliticizes, or this kind of sexual attraction is a form of essentially, well, covering all the crimes under the rug in one way or another.
And this is the kind of inverse of that,
Yeah.
where you have Israelis dressing up as Palestinians in a very pastiche-like way. But the poster on the left is really ominous, because you have a very attractive man dressed as a Palestinian, which is, the caption reads, "We're not letting Halil into our home, keeping secure, not to hiring enemies," which implies the idea of the threat to Israeli women, right? And the image on the right is an image I took with my former collaborator in 2005. We got into a training camp in the Negev desert called Chicago. And this is an image of an Israeli soldier dressed up as a terrorist, photographed, printed out, pasted onto wood, and used as a target in a firing range. And I think one of the things that Ido actually asked me this question is, and we realized that we've seen, you know, at this point, it was about a year in, literally thousands of broken, rubbled, torn Palestinian bodies, and not one wounded or dead Israeli soldier. And this is the one instance that we found on the IDF TikTok channel, which shows a wounded soldier, but he's covered in the Israeli flag. He's got his thumbs up. And the caption was Brotherhood of Warriors, and the name of his unit. And when Israelis are presented as dead, they are dignified because they're inside a coffin, covered in a flag, and they're accompanied by an image of them at their most vital.
Yeah,
right?
their prime.
And what Ido said, and it's totally right, what he read in, is that some bodies are sanctified. Israeli bodies are sanctified. And that sanctification can only happen at the expense of the other. And that tsunami of rubbled images serves to further dehumanize.
One sentence that Palestinian activists and Palestinian themselves share time after time again, which has become no less important in the understanding of the genocide, is we are not numbers, right? And I think that it alludes to the fact that there is a quantitative understanding of victims, right? This is something that we have been exposed to time after time again. 55 killed last week, 17 yesterday. And then there are also those who are becoming qualitative victims, still humanized, still given a face, still given a biography. And this is something that could only exist when the tipping of the amount of victims from either side starts to shift drastically. When we can only understand, well, as it is the case with all genocides, be it from Yugoslavia to even the Holocaust, is the fact that there is a moment in which the visual becomes numerical in order to kind of comprehend it.
And following that, if we do assume that Israel controls the images that are going out, the volume, the sheer quantity of dead Palestinian bodies and broken bodies that we saw, like Hanan's body over here, perhaps it serves a purpose that looking at that sheer volume of broken bodies suggests that these bodies are not worth living, and they're certainly not worth grieving. And even in physical terms, the use of these bunker-busting bombs, that means, I mean, forensic architecture have spoken about this, that everything from the ground level 3 meters below is pulverized. So there's nothing to grieve over. And I think that's the point of these bombs, is that there's nothing left of your family to actually hold and to bury. And I think this is a very important idea of how images, whether they're digital or physical, is a very big distinction.
Yeah.
And I think these are the only, this really struck me, because every city I went to, I saw these images of Israeli hostages posted, printed out and put up on the wall. So it's a kind of temporary, but quite a semi-permanent memorial in a way, that's also shared in a communal way, and it's allowed to be up. Whereas we have to deal alone on our phone, on our particular algorithm. And I think the fact that it exists in a physical space is really important.
Going back to the more historical components of the genocide, it was also crucial for us to relook or reobserve the images of the MACBA from 1947, 1948, which was the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their villages, from their homes, from their cities. And what we found quite striking, going back to the fact that violence is produced not just from presenting it, but also from depriving it, is the fact that these images look very pastoral, right? They look almost like vagabonding people migrating from one place to the other. There is almost no representation in images of the Nakba of an Israeli soldier sticking a gun to people's heads. There is some sort of a forced pastoralization, which also serves geopolitical purposes, and not to say also ethnic ones, given the fact that if people are vagabonding, if they are Bedouins, for example, they don't have a claim over any territory. They don't have a claim over any piece of land. This is something that is, quote unquote, in their nature or in their culture.
This is a picture taken in a place called Mini Israel. So Mini Israel is one of these miniature cities, you know, that it's like a tourist attraction. It's like a 1 to 2,000 scale model of the supposed state of Israel. And you have everything there and it all moving, and there's, you know, aeroplanes. And the only representations of Palestinians are either praying or as shepherds. So again, this notion of them being nomadic, but not represented as members of a contemporary and city or landscape at all. And I think it's also this brought us back to kind of early colonial photographs. And Abigail Solomon Godot speaks well about this in Photography in the Dark, where she speaks about the French. This is not a French picture, but the French colonial pictures from Palestine are all devoid of people. And for long there was an argument that because there were glass plates, the shutter speed was very slow, so if people were there, they were rendered invisible because they moved slowly through it. But it's quite clear that colonial powers chose these pictures and chose these landscapes which were, you know, a people without land for a land without for a people without land. Again, another picture of a series that we took in 2005 and published in 2006. And since 1948, 240 million pine trees have been planted in Israel by the Jewish National Fund. And it was Tzvi Efrat, who was head of Bezalel Architecture School, and his PhD thesis was to map the sites of these forests over the 550 Arab villages that were destroyed. And there's an absolute correlation. And this is a trick that the Zionists learned from the Germans and the Poles, which is if you want to get rid of a crime scene, like a mass grave, you plant pine trees because they grow very quickly. And within about 5 or 10 years, it looks like it's very bucolic and looks like it's been there since the Jurassic period. And the rocks you see, which look like they've been there since the Bible, are actually, that's evidence of the rubble of broken villages and broken homes. And there's a further perversion in the naming of these forests, because they're called the Forest of the 6 Million or the Martyrs' Forest. So when Israelis go for a picnic, what you're doing is you're sitting on a crime scene that looks like nature, because I was told as a child going to a Zionist Jewish school in apartheid South Africa, which we can get to later, but every day told that what we were doing was making the desert bloom, right? And so when you sit and you have that forest in this blooming desert, you're also paying homage to your ancestors who died in the Holocaust, which then justifies the state of Israel. So it's this kind of endless loop.
I'd like to, before we talk about MACBA denialism, I want to maybe, talk with you a little bit about that ecological dimension that you've just discussed. Because many times there's this notion that has become, a truism that in colonialism, what matters most is also the destruction of the nature, right, in order to assert power, in order to assert dominance. But I think that no less important is what you just stated, that in this form of settler colonialism, the creation of nature was no less important, right?
Although those trees are transplanted, and the indigenous trees, being the olives, we know that over 1 million of these olive trees that are, some of whom are 3,000 years old, have been destroyed in 67. So that destruction still exists.
Terraforming.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the visual components of the genocide, but I think that no less important is also the linguistic elements that have led it to permeate and to exist. And essentially for decades, MACBA denialism was a very much popular subject of leaflets of politicians, of cultural products within Israel. This idea that because the people left willingly, because they are presented as leaving under their own free will, there was no such thing as a Nakba, right? It was essentially a complete fabrication. But what is so fascinating is that since the beginning of the genocide, right, and maybe we could move on to the next slide already, there was a means of co-opting the language just as much and using the words that were again utilized in order to articulate the harm and historical wrongdoing as a form of mockery, as a form of verbal abuse in a different way. So these are two images that we've sourced from fascist telegram groups within Israel that were published in the Israeli Independence Day, essentially stating Happy Nakba Day, right? So there is some sort of institutionalized or socialized mockery, right? And if we talk about the other co-option of language, this was an image that was circulated in settler groups in which two girls, blonde, we should say, are holding and waving the Israeli flag on what is or should be, according to them, a beach in the Gaza Strip. And the three words that accommodate this peaceful and serene moment is occupation, banishment, and settlement, right? So there is a complete disintegration of, well, the vocabulary of the struggle, right? Or of essentially Palestinian rights. And maybe also to talk about the other forms of imagination of the Gaza Strip. We see here another image on the left, which states in Hebrew, "What will Gaza look like in 2025? It's in our hands." And this perhaps also alludes to the more ableist language that is used here, because when we say it's in our hands and present, again, disfigured and maimed Palestinians, there is also that element at play. And right next to them, again, a very serene moment by the beach in which settlements are being reconstructed where homes were once present.
And on the right, obviously, we're all familiar with this one, which Trump posted on his Truth Social. There's kind of AI rendering of his what he's going to build on what he calls a demolition zone. And it's really important to notice how many times he calls Gaza a demolition zone, which is the language of an estate agent, not geopolitics. And I think images like this are really important as well, particularly for me coming from South Africa and growing up under apartheid. Images like this were proliferated. The idea of, as J.M. Coetzee put it, the barbarian invasion, and the other was always depicted as a kind of mass. And this comes from the Jewish Task Force. It's a website, and the image is captioned "Gaza in Tel Aviv, July 15th, 2015. And to contrast two images here, a more contemporary image of some youths from the West Bank climbing over the apartheid wall, which I don't know if any of you have been, but we're talking about a tsunami of concrete that's 12 foot high, 3 meters underground, and 500 meters long. It's truly the most horrific barrier. And the image on the right is somehow I landed up watching this film on Netflix called World War Z, which comes from 2013, starring and produced by Brad Pitt. It's a zombie film. I never watched zombie films, but there was one thing about the only safe place in the description was Jerusalem. And the major scene of this film, Brad Pitt flies in a helicopter into Jerusalem, and there's a giant wall around Jerusalem. And inside Jerusalem is like kumbaya, everybody's singing and dancing. And it's surrounded by this giant wall, which looks very much like the apartheid wall. And outside are zombies. And if we just think about that, and we think about how Foucault spoke about infrastructure and the plague, and we apply that, and when I think about my nieces and nephews who live in Israel, who've engaged, my nephew's been in Gaza and fighting in Gaza in the last few years, so in the little I've spoken, I've heard the language, and I think that the most ominous function of this architecture is that it functions to allow the Israelis to imagine the worst possible incarnation of the enemy, of the zombie, of the other, on the other side of that wall.
One of the things that I remember when we engage with the topic is that you recalled quite a bit your own childhood in South Africa, and the fact that within cities there was always some sort of friction or tension, or also an encounter between black people and white people. And the fact that, well, in this contextualization in Palestine, there is also a complete visual segregation of one to the other, using walls, using checkpoints. There is no encounter.
Yeah, and it was illegal in South Africa for us to be together in the same space, but we were in the cities. Yeah. And there was a kind of curiosity and even a kind of, it was always a charged encounter, you know, and there was that curiosity that wall has deprived people of.
We were talking about the mob and the creation of the mob, and also the relationship between fascism and the mob. This idea that the law depends on lawlessness in order to exist, either in forms of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. There's a point in which, well, you need to let the crowds go loose, so to speak, in order to maintain some sort of political stability. And this is exactly what we see here in an image from 1915 of essentially a lynching mob, right? Which also takes up most of the space of this particular photograph. And what is so telling about the lynchings that were taking place in southern United States almost 100 years ago, if not more, were the fact that they also commercialized the harm. They were sold as postcards. They circulated as a souvenir. I remember we looked at one of them, which they described the lynching, one of the people attending it described it as a token of a great day. And the other thing that is worth mentioning is their proximity to the lynched body. And the fact that 100 years ago, when personal cameras were not as popular as they were today, this was, in a sense, a means of presenting yourself to others. This was a form of creating your popularity, of showing to your parents back home, look at me, and in my new life, I'm doing okay. And yeah.
I think we need to talk, and we spoke this afternoon in the seminar about this idea of counter-solidarity, and how this is a perfect example of how the NACP used this exact same images that were used to consolidate membership of white supremacy as evidence, much like those images of the Tinder profiles have been handed over and are being used as evidence now. These, and maybe you could talk about Du Bois and how he kind of narrativized it.
Essentially, especially after 2 years of genocide in which there has been, as you said before, a tsunami of images, we are left with a very uncomfortable archive of harm and decimation and obliteration. And the question is, what do we do with those images? Do we have any usage for them, if at all, of seeing IDF soldiers in the Gaza Strip posing for potential dates of these gestures of performative rape? And essentially, this was something that W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist and also the head of the NAACP, which to this day remains the largest representational body of Black and African Americans in the United States. We could go back to the previous slide. Unlike other intellectuals of his time, he didn't want to castigate these images. He didn't want to shun them. He said that we need to essentially morph them and mutate them from the ethical and moral dimension to the judicial one, to the political one. And in fact, he was so convicted of this that I believe that he sent the letter that I will just read on the right to magazines and journals across the United States, stating something that I think is just as applicable when we think about Gaza today. Would you like to read it?
Just the beginning. Do not look at the Negro. His earthly problems are ended. Instead, look at the 7 white children who gaze at the... You need to read it.
Okay, you forgot your glasses.
Mm-hmm.
His earthly problems are ended. Instead, look at the 7 white children who gaze at this gruesome spectacle. Is it horror or gloating on the face of the neatly dressed 7-year-old girl on the right? Is the tiny 4-year-old on the left old enough, one wonders, to comprehend the barbarism her elders have perpetrated?
And here we see a more, recent incarnation of exactly the same logic. And I think the images we showed you of Tinder, the person collected 1,600 of them. There was 60 gigabytes of material which had the geolocation of the soldiers, and those were handed over to a proper organization who can use those as evidence.
And just in the same manner that after W.E.B. Du Bois essentially moved and transformed these images from the moral dimension to the judicial one, no less important is the fact that all those who participated in the lynching wanted to burn all evidence of their participation, right? This act of solidarity and communal gathering received another dimension and also robbed the perpetrators of their agency, right? Even though they have presented themselves as fully capable and also desiring in those representations.
There's an amazing text by Mark Twain called, I think it's called The Incorruptible Kodak, where he assumes the persona of King Leopold and he bemoans the invention of the Kodak camera because he said suddenly for the first time actual visual evidence is being brought back of crimes committed.
In the Congo, in this case, yeah.
And the image on the right is a Congolese man, Nasala, who's bringing actually the severed, hands and feet of his child to the prefect to show it as proof. And I think here it's important to understand these images from Abu Ghraib and consider the presence of technology, the presence of the camera, and the fact that the taking of these images is very much part of the violence and the torture process and the humiliation. And what was very interesting was when Errol Morris and Philip Gorovich collaborated, and Errol Morris did a documentary, as we know, called Standard Operating Procedure, and Philip Gorovich did the book. But he had the wisdom to say, I'm not going to reproduce these images, because he said to reproduce them is actually to reproduce the violence and the humiliation. And we've seen that more recently in the Berlin Biennale 2 incarnations ago, when these images were pasted up in the Hamburger Bahnhof, very large, next to the work of young Iraqi artists who knew the names of these people. And it's very interesting that we all remember the name of Lindy England, We all remember the name of the white perpetrator. And I think the idea of reclaiming identity of the oppressed, and in this case, Saddam Saleh is able to speak back to the image and to reclaim some sense of wholeness and humanity. And I think this image is really important. It's an image that I used in a book that was published in 2011 called War Primer 2. And it's the famous, one of the stills from an image from WikiLeaks called Collateral Murder. And it's, you know it all, it's from the drone that when they killed the innocent Reuters journalist. And I had this crazy moment when a young Iraqi student who had made his way from Iraq all the way to Germany, literally with an iPhone, that was all he had. And after about 6 months in Germany studying, he came to visit me and he had a copy of the book. And he said to me, you don't realize that this book is the story of my childhood, because it kind of used images from the war on terror. And what he said to me is that the man in the crosshairs is Namir, and that's my brother's best friend. And I'd never considered that. I'd never actually thought to actually name or understand who's in those images.
I'd like to maybe also add some thoughts about this this image, given how striking it is. And in fact, in one of the articles that we published on A-Desk, Adam and I looked quite a bit into the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And General Schwarzkopf was his name, who was essentially the commander who was in charge of this so-called military operation. He was the one who created such aerial images for the first time for public consumption. And one of the things that is so remarkable, again, if we are thinking about who looks at these images and also their juxtaposition, we are shown an image that was shot from a weapon. The identification is no longer with a photographer, but with an actual, well, killing device. And this goes back to, just briefly, I'll mention the conversation that we had with the wonderful PEI participants, is the fact that many times we now understand technology through the violence that it creates, right? And this is something that we understand when we're talking about a live stream genocide, for example, or this is something that we understand by contextualizing the genocide in the Congo through the Kodak, right? Mm-hmm. This is no longer, we do not understand technology as a means of serving us, but we understand technology now as a means of undoing us, right? Which is no less disastrous.
And maybe just a last point is talking to Palestinian colleagues and comrades, understanding the pervasive existence of surveillance. For instance, Issa Amro, who I've worked with a lot, who described to me that from the moment he gets up in the morning till the moment he goes to sleep, he is constantly surveyed. There's a surveillance camera every 100 feet, every 30 meters. And if we consider the kind of, if we could name the gaze, it's a malevolent one of that surveillance camera. It's about control. It's about humiliation. It's about intrusion. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to make a counter-surveillance, to make a benevolent gaze. But I think we should stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam and Ido. We'll wait a little bit while we get there, while they get to plug into translations. I'm sure there's many questions, so I won't delay the Passover, but I just want to thank you for one very specific thing, which is to put on the table this understanding and awareness that the violence in these images is repeated, but that also a very delicate way of addressing that responsibility. What does it mean to put these things on the table again, these very harmful images, but that also have a purpose somehow? And I feel that the care around that act of responsibility, counter solidarity, and also finding a function around that, which I think is really important. What you mentioned of addressing it as a legal tool, which is one of several purposes that they can have. So I'm sure there's many.
Can I just briefly reply with gratitude, because I think we were speaking about institutional responsibility, and honestly, to be able to sit in an institution of this caliber in the cultural sphere and be able to talk about this without fear of the police outside coming is very rare. And I feel so, I'm able to breathe and I'm able to think, and I'm really grateful. And I think that you're really meeting institutional responsibility, and I've seen one institution after another collapse under state pressure in Germany in order to receive their funding and their grants. So I really salute you, and I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a collective body of gratitude that we have here. So I will open it up to the floor, because I could even hear murmurings as you were passing.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I just wanted to go back to the images and the gaze. And I was just wondering about, what about the saturation of the gaze? The saturation of images and the consumption. I asked myself, am I contributing when I, repost and put stories? Am I contributing to a sort of a normalization of that violence on a daily basis? And how to deal with that?
I think, thanks for the question. I think it's really spot on. And I made a personal decision at the start of, well, when was the start of the genocide? In 2019 or 2000, you know, it's like 19, but not ever to repost an image of a wounded or dead Palestinian body out of respect. But I think the proliferation and the repeat and the reposting and the kind of what you call the saturation of those images, it serves a purpose. And, you know, very much like I said in Judith Butler's logic, that what it asserts is that, what it implies is that these bodies are not worth being alive, and they're certainly not worth being grievable or grieving over. And I think that mass, I think it functioned for the State of Israel, and I think they allowed it, and I think they realized that mass of bodies, and when it becomes, there's such a volume that it's impossible to name, and feeds into the dehumanization. You know, this is rubble. It's a construction site. It's not, you know.
When we were researching this, it was very interesting to read photography books or, well, like theoretical books about photography from the 1980s and 90s, kind of the heyday of cynical postmodernism, in which a lot of writers, some of which I really appreciate, such as Susan Sontag, to give one blatant example, blame photojournalists as essentially imperial agents, right? Orientalists in the making. And going back to the theme that now we understand technology through violence, that distinction of photographer and photographed has now somewhat collapsed, right? A lot of people now document themselves amidst their own violence, and therefore they have an agency and also a voice in how they want to reiterate that violence. One thing that we didn't discuss, but is no less important, this lecture is central, its emphasis is on the photographic. But we can't really deny the fact that most of us have consumed videos when looking into Gaza. And it is true that with this more narrativized form, if we could call it that, there is also a different understanding of the actors presented or the subjects presented in them. And then the engagement that they could have with us as an unwilling audience, unwilling to, in the sense that, well, it is immense violence, right, differs as a result of that.
I mean, and just another point is, recently I've been working with a lot of Gazan filmmakers and photographers who want to continue their studies, and we've been set up an organization to evacuate them and find them places in schools. And looking at their work, it's incredibly, it resists those images. They calm, the pace is slow, and they are incredibly poetic. And, you know, one of them, Mo, made this film just literally just looking at the sky, and there was one day when there were just no airplanes or bombs, and it was just, you know, this kind of search for the opposite of that saturation of violence. And I think just to say that, you know, the future is their voices, because they are, you know, those are the future storytellers.
Hello. Yep. Thank you. Here. I wanted to ask, but now that I am about to ask, I think about a reason. I wanted to ask why you think that, and I agree that Israel is really controlling the images, they are not leaked, and the images of soldiers are glorified and dignified, but the images of their hostages, at least from the beginning, the ones that circulated on social media were really promoted by Israeli supporters, were not dignified at all, their bodies, like being even fake images or fake stories about hostages being raped or beheaded. And now that I'm posing the question, I maybe think that serves a purpose too, that is the one of those bodies are not also they are not worth being saved. They are already gone or dehumanized.
I'm going to let you answer, but there's one thought that Ido had and articulated is the imagined images that were articulated and were written about on October 7th, October 8th, and these beheaded babies in ovens. And those images are seared into all of our minds, although they were just words and they never existed. So thank you for raising that, but I'll let you answer.
So it's no question about the fact that Israeli hostages were abused because, I mean, it also served geopolitical interest. And I think that in the case of hostages, both from the Palestinian and the Israeli side, it's worthy to keep in mind that the limitation of political discourse was also the limitation of photographic discourse. Palestinian hostages were not photographed. They were not documented. They were shunned from the gaze, and therefore I think it is no coincidence that they were not part of public conversation. The images of hostages also served a different function, which is to put them in a state of limbo, in which Israel did not know if they were dead or alive, right? It was some sort of horrible Schrodinger's cat. Now, when we are talking about the surrealism or the fakery regarding violence, reminds me of a film series of Gazans documenting themselves during the genocide, to go back to your question. And one element that I found to be very curious is that a lot of, again, the Gazans said that seeing this utter obliteration was like walking through a dream, right? And why is that? I was thinking to myself. And then I think, at least this is my response, is that violence is an act of surrealism, in the sense that violence destroys the real. Violence tears apart your home, your body, everything that you've perceived in reality. And when that form of surrealism becomes socialized, there's a very little distinction between surrealism and, in fact, hallucination, to be quite frank. And with that comes also exaggeration. There comes, well, telling up stories. And this has been no less evident in October 7th as it was in different historical iterations.
And I think it's also important to recognize the role that part of genocide is the destruction of knowledge. And so that speaks to the kind of disassociation when it's not just the destruction of the physical people, but the knowledge, and that's part of the tactic.
I was going to ask exactly about that, like the imaginary image and how it also it's attacked. It's like, it was interesting because we have this comparison now that we can see these imaginary images in this like very like technological way that are AI videos that are giving us these suggestions of what can be in a perverted way, of course, in these cases. But versus this other way, more like low-tech, more old school way of engraving these ideas, which is exactly like the October 7, like disinformation campaigns about the dead babies, that in the space that I was inhabiting at the time, there was a policy of no political information in the space, but there started to be symbolic information. Like one day we arrived and there were 40 lit candles, and I'm also thinking of maybe like that infamous, like the Donald Trump, they're eating the cats and they're eating the dogs kind of thing. And for me, I see the exaggeration in both cases, but I just want to like hear about you, like this comparison of do they act in the same way like the AI generated and like just like the imaginary image, or one can be more perverse than the other, more dehumanizing?
I mean, what comes to mind for me is going back to 9/11, and I remember conversing with Ian Boal, who was a member of a collective called Retort, and he described 9/11 as an image wound sustained by the West, by the empire, by America. And he described the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as genocidal pursuits for images that could reply to that. And we remember the so-called leaked images of the execution of Saddam, or even when he came out of the rabbit hole and they had the torch down his throat, as like literally a kind of perverse intrusion into the body, or the toppling of his statue, and or George Bush standing proclaiming victory. There were all these kind of imaginary images. I could imagine an art director literally writing a description and then they enacted it. And I think it's quite curious to think of those wars as a pursuit of images, and to think of this in a similar way.
Thank you for your lecture and for organization. I'm coming from Slovenia, previously Yugoslavia, and I would like to go a little bit back to images and photographies. Recently in Slovene social media and also broadly Yugoslav social media, there were a surge of happy images, happy photographies of happy children from Gaza, and then there was a line below that they were killed on that date. What do you think about this? Well, happy images, would they can they become kind of a counter image to other photographies that you talked about? Thank you.
With the participants of the PEI workshop, we were also talking a little bit about what is the role of emotion in order to galvanize an audience, right? Is there really a distinction between an image that depresses us or an image that also, again, as you stated, portrays the humanity of people, right? Not just their, again, to keep them in the limbo of death, but also grant them the permission of remaining alive. And I have to admit that I myself am skeptical about what has been a holy grail or the pursuit of the perfect image that would galvanize people into political action. I think that there have been many iterations of that since the Bengal famine in the 1860s to the Vietnam War. We could think about Napalm Girl and so on and so forth. And I think that this is not really a question of the image itself as much as it is the form in which they are socialized. We have seen from both our research, Adam and I, that images presented in public space, for example, are far more powerful than anything presented in the digital sphere. There is something about the presentation, or essentially the absorbment of what is happening there to what is happening here, which I believe is far more meaningful and provokes emotions not just in the context of the image, but also in the observer. Because we depend also on the consent or also on the emotions of other people, which are, well, sharing the same public space as us.
I'm not going to answer your question, but this, what I sat wondering is what images changed the discourse, which we saw happen about 3 months ago, 4 months ago. And for me, it seems quite convincing that the image of starving children and the lineage of that kind of iconic image that we can trace back, that was the red line that seemed to allow all the politicians and all the kind of cultural speakers to utter the word genocide. And I can't quite make sense of it, but when I think there's something embedded in us of this idea that's a universal thing, that suddenly a starving child is a starving child, it exists. And I think that was the tipping point. And I haven't quite traced the roots of it, but I'm sorry not to answer your question, but it just provoked that thought.
Well, thank you once again for these heartbreaking images and your kindness and brutal honesty through them. No, and as much as that also causes in you, this reflection, but also many other feelings. I wanted to, if you can, both of you, or either specifically in the last point, you were talking about the formulation of a spectatorship in a way, no? When you had talked about audience and the audience of those photography that were seen in Slovenia. No? And I say this because I feel also there is, of course, a purpose behind this generation of image making, that if we go back to the pastoral you show, there is a sense of history making. In fact, I was thinking the same when you take, for instance, no, the presentation of the Saints Forest or the Southern Martyrs Forest. There is a sense in which the evidence is generating a different discourse. And that has to do with the way in which that has, as you say now, I think it was you, Adam, when you were talking about the fact that there is a moment in which things shift, right? There is an intention to generate a kind of spectatorship that is going to respond to that image, no? First and foremost, to take things into action, politically speaking, but also in order to galvanize a certain kind of mass behind a particular idea. And whereas I feel, and I want to try to, and I'm saying this as a reflection that I have now listening to you guys. So if we take the pastoral images and we understand the number of images that were sort of circulating at the time, the way in which everything was under control at the time in a very specific way. But of course, there is a limited number of images. There were those and only those. Now, we have a massive saturation, but again, is addressed to somehow fulfill the same idolatria. No? All of that is part of the same formulation of history making in terms of audience making, in terms of spectatorship. I don't know, I suppose in my head, what is really crazy is that we're still in a world in which that incongruence is made possible because the image making that are shared and shift to response to a specific means, right? And again, this is us. We are the ones, not necessarily this group, but I mean like people at the end of the day. Spectatorship and history making are going hand in hand. No? And I go back to the voice, no? To the wa. Don't look at the Negro, look at the white gaze. No? Like how can we, we take that, how can we discuss our role in making or taking agency of a spectatorship that are inviting us to, or forcing us to go in, no? Like I feel like this is so critical at this point.
If there is a political obligation, if there is a moral obligation, it is to highlight the absence, right? To bring the background to the foreground over and over again. You were talking about the pastoralization that existed during the MACBA, but I am also compelled to argue with you just a little bit and say that this is it's a public platform. Thank you so much. Love this mic. It is no less important to state that this is not purely historical. In fact, this is something that is happening today. I'll give you just one example. I have a strange fixation on architectural forums. I like them quite a bit, and for some reason, I've committed myself to the Saudi one, in which they are presenting phantasmagorical projects such as The Line, which I'm sure that a lot of people here have heard about. For those who have not, it's essentially an apocalyptic project run by the Saudi kingdom, a city democrated to a 3-kilometer long line, and I believe that the margins are, well, something like 500 meters from place to place. With these images of architectural rendering and these drone shots of, again, a land without a people, a pure desert, no one really talks about the hundreds of tribes and people who were also just pushed aside in order to create this vanity project, right? There is also a sense, and here I owe this observation to a wonderful book written by Sintujan Varatraja and Moshtari Hillel, both activists and public speakers in Germany, who've said that many times solidarity with one group is used as a means to conceal your abuse of another. So, for example, and this is where it gets very tricky, the support of the Moroccan government in Palestine as a means to distract the public of the abuse of people in Western Sahara. And we could say the same thing about the Malaysian government. And we could say this time after time again. What is important is to situate that just because you are in solidarity with one group, it does not mean that you are absolved from other political obligations and other social obligations that you might have. We all know of the fact that in a lot of solidarity groups, which again Adam and I talked about, is the fact that solidarity is not inherently progressive. We all know that in such groups there is racism, there is anti-Semitism, there is transphobia. The project is never complete. What is important is to, again, bring the background to the foreground.
Can I answer from a much more personal perspective, which is thinking about race and looking at the white man? I think back to my ancestors, my grandparents, who all got on boats from the Pale, from Eastern Europe, so Lithuania and Poland. They got on boats as the oppressed Jews running for their life from the pogroms and the imminent Holocaust. And within 3 weeks, they stepped foot on South African land, and they transformed, their identity was transformed from the oppressed Jew into a white oppressor. And it's an identity that they embraced thoroughly and very quickly. And they had full access to all the privilege that the apartheid regime offered them as white people. And I think I would say that our responsibility now is, and I take this from one of the most difficult books that I've read in the last year, which is, I think it's called Whites, Jews and Us. Many of you might have read it by Huria Butelja. And really the most confrontational book that I've read in a long time. And in it, she speaks about Genet, I believe, who actually was able to betray his white race. And I think that that's our responsibility. And I think, but essentially, and to echo what Ido said, is it's about giving the platform now to Palestinian voices. That's it. I think we need to keep quiet. I'd like to get out of here and keep quiet.
No, thank you so much. And we were in agreement, by the way.
So, okay. Well, I actually have a question. I'm sorry. Well, it's maybe a comment around, I think it's really important to have this issue not only of accountability, but ethics of producing images, reproducing images, and gazing at images. And I think that throughout your talk, you were constantly putting an emphasis on this. But one I mean, for me, mothering throughout a genocide has been so schizophrenic to see these images after putting my child to bed. And I think accepting the violence of having to share that, like, it's not that people share those images freely. Like, it has a really high cost for a mother to share that image of their child. And I think that's very, very different from the cost of, or not even the cost, but the way that, for example, Trump Trump and his friends can share these kinds of images with total impunity. And I feel that with no cost. And I think that that's really important in relation to what you both stated in connection to what can be said and where can it be said. And I think that that's something that I feel is really, really important to underline. We had Motaz, a photographer, Palestinian photographer here, and he said, I want to share images of beautiful Gaza. These are not the images I want to produce. This is a responsibility that he had to take on at a very, very, very high cost. So I think that this is really sort of a nuance that is necessary in these days. I, for example, cannot share those images of those children, but I understand the need for that to happen.
I mean, something that came up in the seminar, which was about solidarity and images' relationship with solidarity, was what is the cost? Sharing a black square on Blackout Tuesday during Black Lives Matter, every celebrity shared that. The whole of social media was just black squares, and it was easy to do that at no cost. And I think that the cost of something is a very important measure of political action and responsibility right now. And people say, why are you staying in Berlin? I mean, it's like criminal charges and an anti-Semite who advocates for terrorism against Jews, and while I'm burying my Jewish mother, I think it's important to stay there. And yeah.
If I could just say one final thing, you were talking about the schizophrenic experience during the genocide, and I felt that quite a bit because having grown up in West Jerusalem, I still have I had a lot of friends there, and I had a life there. And for the past 2 years, my feed, and this is also very important to specify, that it does not constitute public space, and it can never, 5 monopolies at best can never really, constitute really any sort of sophisticated or nuanced discourse. And I think that, again, we have been hedged in ways that we could only understand later on. But when we are talking about violence, it is no less important to state that it is permeated by its absence or by ignoring it. Because while half of my feed has been dedicated to such images that you've discussed, other ones were about people having natural wine and, going to the beach and having like a pretty sweet time,
Where in
Tel Aviv or in West Jerusalem. And this is something that, again, I remember actually having this conversation with a Russian friend of mine who felt a great deal of guilt going back to her village, picking up mushrooms with her family, when, again, Ukrainian children are abducted and sent to be Russified in her country. And I agree with her fully. The difference is also geographical. We have heard from people who have felt their windows shake in Tel Aviv while Gaza has been bombed, and it didn't really kind of constitute any kind of, great transformation, right? And I think that this is kind of the shock that, again, violence vulgarizes its absence.
Well, yeah, I would like to close up now unless there's a last voice. With the last line of a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, hinted by Elvira, that says, "And those children will wait for their heroic father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price." And I thank you again, Ido and Adam, and all of you here for sharing that burden of looking at, really directly looking at who's paying the price. And I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd ask you to help me applaud our guests for their work. I would also like to thank very much our team. We have a technical team, our translators who are hiding behind this wall, Silvia and Jauma, and also our regidor and our PEI team. But really, thank you all so much for being here. Muchas gracias por venir. Y los dejo invitados. El 3 de septiembre tenemos aquí, el 3 de noviembre, muchas gracias. Tenemos Palestine Cinema Days. It will be our third consecutive year doing Palestine Cinema Days, which cannot happen anymore in Ramallah. So it happens every November all over the world in different institutions. It will happen here. So you're all welcome. Please come. That's on the 3rd of November. And then on the 5th of November, we have the opening of our amazing show towards Black Planet, a project for Black Planet, sorry. And there will be a talk also at that opening. So I really absolutely urge you to attend. And we have a performance that week to link to our entire program. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being this collective body.